welcome to this episode of the Voices InCourage podcast. I'm Steve Carey, the producer of this podcast and a proud member of the team. And normally I work behind the scenes doing all the production, all the tech, and all of the things that go with producing the podcast and the content distribution. But today, I get the extremely fun job of stepping in front of the mic and having a conversation with KL Wells. I have been part of this journey from behind the scenes, and I've heard the stories firsthand that she has been sharing on this podcast. And I'm really honored that I get to be part of this conversation today to bring to you some of the big details on what has transpired over the last few years, and they are profound. So I'm looking forward to this. And KL, thank you for bringing this idea to light, because I think it's really going to have an impact audience.
I totally agree.
So where I'd like to start out with is, let's just give a short recap to bring everybody up to speed from those dark days in years past to the story that we want to begin with today, because there is another challenge that we're going to get into.
Yeah. So this story goes back to 2017 when my son's father passed away. And actually passed away in 2016. But in 2017, it was very apparent to us that Sam was dealing with drug issues. And in 2018, I stood on a sidewalk in Washington State and witnessed the arrest of my son at gunpoint, and while he was in a drug psychosis. Those of you who have followed us have heard this story. I did a TED Talk and explained this story. So I would encourage you to go, listen to that, because that's not really what the focus of today is. That was just one major traumatic moment that we've put a pin in. And I'm very able to talk about, what happened in those moments, and also what was my recovery as his mom in those moments from the traumatic situation that occurred around that, and my journey as a parent who loves someone who has been dealing with substance use disorder and all the recoveries and relapses and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important for our audience to understand that our journey is also about recovery. Our journey is about being able to live a life that we love while thriving, while we have somebody that we love dearly that we're witnessing them suffering. And that is hence the podcast title, is because I set an intention early on, because I have a life I love, I have work that I love, I have a marriage that I love, I have friends that I love, that thriving for me was going to be non-negotiable. I don't know that I even had a remote inkling about how challenging that intention was going to be. However, I have stayed steadfast in my commitment to it. And so y'all have been along the journey, or if you're entering right now with us, we're going to talk a little bit about the last couple of years when the journey took a very dark turn. And that's what prompted wanting to have this conversation, is to say, okay, the stakes got higher a couple of years ago.
They did. And I wanted to jump in really quickly, because you have been steadfast in this message that it is possible to thrive in the face of this trauma, of this craziness. And a lot of people don't recognize that not only is it a possibility, yet there is an opportunity to raise your standards. And I wanted to bring you back to something that you've said to me throughout this journey, which is, you started Voices InCourage because you did not have at your fingertips any level of resources for how to accomplish that. You knew that was your standard, that I am a high performer in life. I help people maintain high performance in their professional lives. Yet here I am in crisis, and I need the tools to help me maintain high levels of performance at an emotional and psychological level. And I want to come back to that, because you've learned a lot along the way. Not only have you found all of the tools that you've developed for yourself and done the research, but you've also discovered a lot of external resources that you didn't know about then, but you know about now.
Right, exactly. And so, through the journey of doing this podcast, meeting all different kinds of people, we were introduced to Beverly Buncher, who began a program that I was completely unaware of 14, 15 years ago, called the BALM program, BALM. And it stands for Be a Loving Mirror. And she wrote a book, and she has a number of on-demand online programs that are life-changing. And so, I'm a big fan, and we are in partnership at this point because I'm not going to do that work. But if I had known she was available, it would have so short-tracked my ability to get to peace and calm versus years of cobbling together, figuring out how to be at peace and calm and thrive in the midst of my son's dealing with substance use disorder. And so if you are in the throes of the chaos, the helplessness, the loss of hope, you're suffering yourself because it's really difficult to be in this moment, I strongly encourage you to go to voicesincourage.com/family and click on that link. It will take you to Beverly's 12 Principles program. And it is a 3-month program that will absolutely transform your life. So big kudos to her for putting this program together. I wish I'd known about it earlier. We are on the same page relative to changing people's lives from trauma and tragedy to actually being able to be a loving person in the midst of all of it and be at peace and calm. So that is one that I'm a big fan of. And so even in the midst of that, I did not know her or know of her program when we found out that Sam was addicted to fentanyl. And for me, that was one of those moments where I'm sure my eyes popped and my jaw dropped when I was on the phone with him when he gave me that news.
This is the moment that we alluded to earlier, the moment where this story takes a deeper and darker and much more dangerous turn. So even before this, there have been multiple relapses and recoveries. This introduced a new disturbing chapter in this journey. And I think that's to set up the rest of what we're going to talk about. How did you navigate this new turn?
Well, I think certainly all along the way, I've been learning more and more and more. All of us hear about fentanyl, but when you're in the midst of loving somebody who has this disease, fentanyl takes it to a completely different level. And one wrong dose and they're gone. And so if you're using fentanyl as your drug of choice, you just face multiple times throughout every single day because you need to get fentanyl every hour and a half in order to feed the disease. So knowing that, wow, so many times a day could be the moment. When we lost him, I was like, holy crap, this went to a completely different level. And so I had built in all these things that I have been doing to take care of myself in the midst of all of this, to thrive and so on and so forth. And every time I get like kind of a gut punch, I take it and then I go, okay, I need to bring something else to the table that's going to add on top of what I'm already doing, that's going to up level my skill set, because even with him dealing with fentanyl, I still wanted to thrive in the midst of this. I did not want my life hijacked by his disease, hijacked by the worry that goes with this disease. And so I had run across a program called Positive Intelligence that's been put together by Shirzad Chamine. There's a book called Positive Intelligence. There's actually a program. It's called a PQ program. And I stepped in and did the program as it's an online app program. Loved it, loved the book, loved Shamine's work, and then subsequently became a coach. So I now coach and train on positive intelligence. And my stepping into that has helped me so tremendously be able to, as we were talking, offline before we got on, some people say I had a bad day. Number one, unless it's traumatic, I'm not sure why you would have a completely bad day. You're giving your power away, but let's just say for sake, you have a bad day. PQ program has helped me go from a day to a quarter day to a half day to a quarter day to 10 minutes. I can turn around anything that's showing up that might throw me, might challenge me, might sabotage me in a very short period of time. And then I have access to my own creativity, my clarity about the situation, my ability to rise and be in my own power in the midst of it, and to be compassionate and confident that I have the skills to be able to navigate whatever shows up. And so that adding that program has been life-changing. And in the midst of that, a couple things I think are really important to know about the journey is we find out Sam's addicted to fentanyl, and he's on the other side of the coast. So I couldn't get to him any way, shape, or form.
This is a few years ago.
This is a couple years ago.
2023.
Yes. And then finally, in 2023, May 9th, he called me, and he was in very dire strait. His best friend for half his life had moved out because he was stealing and blind and left him alone. And he was scared, and he begged me to bring him home. And honestly, the courage and the fortitude that it took, the emotional courage that it took to say no to him was present for me because I'd been doing this work. And
I was just going to remark, just looking back, you've talked about boundaries, and you had this discussion with Beverly as well, being able to preserve your own self and well-being because you have these boundaries set up. One of the fundamental skills that you had built up put to an ultimate test in this scenario.
Yes, absolutely. Because he's desperate, and I don't know what choice he's going to make. And so he's, crying and so on and so forth. So we get off the phone, and I'm left with what's going to happen next. And what do I do next to be able to breathe? What do I do next to be able to navigate the next day when I'm having a mastermind group that I am facilitating all day long? And what I would say is, I said to him as we got off, I will call you tomorrow morning. Well, as I'm going to that mastermind group, I called and his phone was dead. So I get to my group meeting, and I did what I expect them to do when times show up and they're really tough, is I said, this is what's happened. And I just need you to know that right now, I'm fragile. And I didn't want to give it like, today's going to be a hard day for me. I wanted to give it right now, I'm fragile. And even as I said it out loud, I could feel the ease, at least expressing where I was. And I know I'm in a safe place with these people. And so I was present for that day in a way that I normally am present for those days.
I think that's a remarkable point to just talk about momentarily, because in this story that you're recapturing, there's a fork for both of you. Em has asked to come home. You establish your boundaries very clearly to preserve your own well-being, yet you lose contact with them. So there's huge uncertainty on your side, and then he's off on his, we don't know what he's doing at that moment. And then you have to show up and perform. Yet an opportunity to talk about one of the skill sets that you talk about often, which is to be able to be present with your feelings and communicate that. And that moment, which would for many people turn into, I can't perform at all today, let alone this week, into a moment that you acknowledged what you're going through, and you had a safe community. They knew of you and about you. And then you use that as one of the tools of many to transition through that time and into the rest of your day. So I think it's remarkable, but also it's very logical when I hear you talk about it. Think about, okay, you brought out this tool that you had. It was hard, just like exercising can be hard, but you brought it out and you were in shape. So you knew that you could do that, and it worked. And I think that's part of living the life of thriving despite the challenges of the moment.
Yeah, I genuinely think number one is that I live a life of authenticity and genuineness. And with my mastermind group, I'm going to tell them, where I am. It never occurred to me not to show up. And I realize that happens all the time for people. It never occurred to me to try to put the mask on, that I was okay. I'm very big on people being genuine and authentic in their vulnerability. And so that's who I was in that moment. And by allowing myself that moment, I also was right where I needed to be. This is a community that loves me. And that is another reason why building a very strong community is super important in this journey. It is, for me, 95% of the success or failure of being able to be resilient, thrive in the midst of this chaos and desperation, and they are one of my communities. And so then out of that space, I accessed my skills and my resilience and continued moving forward until the next time I heard from Sam, which actually was that night because he had found a rehab. And, I was super proud of him. For him, he's super resourceful, as most addicts are. And he decided that this was the next step for him. And then there's this gap of 5 weeks of hearing nothing. So, as a parent, what do you do in the midst of the 5 weeks? And so it's
Let
this
me
work. Yeah.
let me jump in. Like,
Okay.
set the stage. So you have a crisis moment. He
Mm-hmm.
wants to come home.
Mm-hmm.
You say no. The next day, you don't hear from him. So
Mm-hmm.
that gap is profoundly difficult. And then you do get some good news because he calls and says, "Hey, I'm going into rehab." After that, you enter another gap of time where you
Mm-hmm.
don't know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you have confirmation that he did indeed get to rehab? Or was it just, here's my intention, and then you don't hear from him? And I'm asking that because it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like good news, but I don't think it necessarily is. It's a moment in time where you where it sounds like there might be some good news coming, but yet you go into
Mm-hmm.
another information void, which
Mm-hmm.
introduces a whole set of additional challenges to navigate.
Yeah. And that's a really great point, Steve. One was he was calling me from the rehab center. So I knew he was there. But, I mean, how many times had he gone to a rehab center and then jumped the fence that night? I just
Right,
knew this was going to be different. The way that I think about relapses and recovery is it very much feels like it's a upward trajectory. At least that's how I have viewed Sam's story, just like my own story. It's been an, kind of upward
right.
trajectory.
And there may be
Um,
some times where you go 4 steps forward and a few steps
hmm
back, but you
hmm
do another four. You're continually incrementing upwards and improving.
Right. Right. Yes. And so, anybody who's been in this journey knows you're going to have these gaps of time. And so, what do you do with those gaps of time? I didn't want to spend that gap of time vociferating on what could go wrong and worrying constantly all the time. That's no way to live a life. And again, being very committed to living in the thriving zone. So, this is where you skill up because complete unknown certainty. And that's life, honestly. And so learning to be in that place and still be able to live a life, still be able to laugh, still be able to have fun, still be able to be joyful in my own life while I'm in the midst of not knowing anything. You also learn on this journey too is that the notion that you think you know what's going on so often is like so untrue.
Let's talk about that for a moment because before we started recording, you had mentioned something and it stayed in my head for a bit. But in this
Mhm.
time, this gap, you're navigating life and you're trying to exercise all the skills that you have. And you
Mhm.
talked about not letting the fear-based stories in your head take over. And there's
Mhm.
2 points I think are really important is that these still happen. uh,
Yes.
you're not immune from the fear-based stories, but it's
Mm-mm.
how you navigate them and how
Mhm.
you decide get through that is what I think is really profound and important for people to hear because all of us have the stories that are going on in our head, but it's how you deal with it. So walk us through what that looked like for you and what that still continues to look like.
Well, honestly, I mean, as of March 10th, no, May 10th this year, Sam will be 2 years in recovery. And I saw him in January. And he is thriving, working, making a great living, has a great relationship with his girlfriend. He's very well supported by a great sponsor and is regularly going to meetings. He is doing the life that will support his recovery. But just I mean, what, 10 days ago, I hadn't heard from him in a little bit. And I think it's the habit of worry that will, rise up and grab you. That's what happened to me. It rose up and grabbed me. And so I'm aware of what's taking place. It's a habit of thinking, which actually creates a habit of emotion. And then it creates a habit of behavior. And so I'm aware of the thought that's going through my mind. It's so instantaneous. I'm also aware of the emotions that I'm starting to feel, which is completely uneasy and potentially upset. because I'm not hearing from him. And so my energy becomes exhausted. I'm less capable than what I normally am. I might not sleep well. I might have a restless night of sleep. And in fact, I did have one restless night of sleep. And so then I was like, okay, well, this is totally not serving me, because I'm going to hear from him when I'm going to hear from him. I'm going to, reach out to him, and it'll be what it's going to be. And so I grabbed a hold of all my tools again. I realized, I was kind of sabotaging myself. I was sabotaging my own recovery in this. And I'm like, I'm not willing to do that. So I appreciate you trying to keep me safe, whatever that thought is that's going through my head. You're not helping. So it's almost like, you're having a conversation with yourself, and you've got to take your power back. You've got to take your thought power back. You got to take your emotional power back. You got to take your behavioral power back. And I know for me, great music is super important. I know gratitude, super important. I know all the things that I do that are super important, and they help do that energy shift and that thought shift and that emotional shift very quickly. And I just had to be on top of it for it to gain the power back.
What does that look like for you when you said I had to get a hold of that very quickly? What does that shift look like for you, just to put it in perspective?
Well, first it's awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we are again. Oh, there's that thought again. Oh my God, that's not serving me. It could take me down, a little dark vortex of negativity. So awareness first. And then all the things that I do, I would consider them kind of pattern interrupts. Is I'm going to interrupt that thought. I'm going to interrupt that emotion. I'm going to interrupt that potential worry of sleep in ways that is going to let it know I'm taking my power back from you. I'm not going to allow you to run the show. And so it's almost like it's separate and apart from me, but it keeps showing up as a pest. And so I'm going to put the pest, back in the box. I'm going to interrupt the pest. I'm not going to give it the voice that it thinks it has. I'm going to call out my highest version of myself, my strongest version of myself, my thriving version, my resilient version, my happy version, my joyful version. And it is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the other is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So does that help?
Yeah, and just I'm also trying to create a very easy pattern for the listeners to understand. You talked
Mm-hmm.
about maybe having one difficult night of sleep, and then
Mm-hmm.
as these stories come into your mind, you have the tool sets that you're using to take back your power. Time-wise, what does that look like for you? You maybe lost a one night of sleep, or maybe didn't lose it, but you had a tough night of sleep. But overall, like, are we talking about a day, an hour, moments?
It was kind of 2 days where I was running behind, underneath the surface, so to speak. One night, not good sleep. And then I just got my traction back.
I love that because it grounds what you're doing and what you're advocating for.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, we're sharing that these challenges don't stop. It's how you adapt to
Mm-hmm.
it, which is
Mm-hmm.
what I've heard you say. When you
Yeah.
describe those feelings, the negative feelings that go with all of that, when you don't have that power, helplessness, worry, fear, all the intrusive thoughts, it occurred to
Mm-hmm.
me that so many people, that's where they live all the time
Right.
in this scenario that you have gone through, are going through. But that is a constant, and they don't know that there is a different version of life that they could be living. That's just normal.
Right. I think what happens is that people think this is just the way it is. You have somebody that you love that is addicted, and the trauma, the desperation, the chaos, the fear, the worry. Some people just think, well, this is just my life. And what we've talked about, what Voices InCourage is all about is if you're open to another way of looking at it, it doesn't have to be your life. You really can begin to take your life back even while you have somebody who is sick and dealing with this disease. And now, I know so many people, and we have programs that allow you to begin to that journey back to a life that moves from crisis to surviving to struggling to thriving. And there have been people who have said to me when I've floated the notion that you can thrive in the midst of loving somebody who has this disease, and they're like, you are crazy. There is like no way And they're wedded to that story. That's how I think about it. It's a little bit like we're in the middle of doing a 21-day sleep challenge and putting that together. And it's so funny to talk to people. They are wedded to their stories of not being able to sleep. And they're not open the potentiality that if they did some things, they're like, I've tried everything. And when I start to ask more questions and they begin to realize, no, I really haven't. I've only done like this much versus like all this much, but they're wedded to their story. They shut it down. And so that's what happens in this journey too, is I run into people who aren't open to seeing the possibilities of living a life of love, peace and calm, joy, and thriving in the midst of loving somebody. And I just know that I'm doing it. And I know more and more people, because that's who I'm looking for as examples that are doing it. And so in some ways, I think this journey is about getting a toehold and then a foothold and then a body hold. People who have learned and skilled up to actually thrive in the midst of this disease.
As we're wrapping up the conversation, because I know that you have some obligations, but I think this is a really powerful note to end on. And I wanted to add something that I've heard you talk about over and over, and it folds into this. And it's also the reason why I had asked you to give some examples of time and just realistic examples that people can grab onto. Because sometimes when you see somebody doing something that is so far beyond what you think is possible or realistic, we tend to put people on a pedestal and say, I can't. And what you're doing is not remarkable in the sense that it's so challenging that only a few people can do it, only if they work really hard. It's remarkable because you are doing it against what is traditional expectations and conventions. Yet you talk about this idea of agency. You are open to this idea of that it is possible to thrive despite the scenario in your life, which is all consuming. You do have agency, and that one tiny beacon of hope, if that opens up in somebody's mind that, wow, I do have a choice here. I have a decision and a choice of how I can go forward. And it won't be easy, but I do have a choice, and you do have agency at that moment to make a change. And that's the invitation that I've heard you give so many times to so many people. And that opens a door to a new possibility. And that, I think, is the one message that I think if there's anything people could hear from this story, you do have that opportunity, that agency to make a difference in your expectations of yourself. And
Absolutely.
All it comes down to tools and practicality after that big decision.
Yes. And we are all far more powerful than we give ourselves credit for. I've utilized so many different tools, and we've talked about a lot of different things, through the 70 podcasts that we've done so far. I continue to look for tools, and I just want to, kind of close this out. If you are suffering right now, you are in a desperate place, you are living in the chaos of your loved one's disease, please, please, please go to voicesincourage.com/family. There is a program that can help you reframe and take your agency back, take your power back, and begin to step from crisis to thriving and back into the power of peace and calm. So with that, I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground. We still have some more ground to cover. And I'm going to leave you with this is the next one. We're going to talk about when Sam's stepsister passed away. That was his moment of which way is he going to go.
Perfect. I look forward to it. And yes, I know we're only scratching the surface of the methods and the tools and the strategies that you utilized as you navigated all of this. And these are all just milestones that you have gone through, but different versions of these show up in everyone's lives. So I know there's relevance for the people who are listening to us out there. And so for our audience, I thank you for tuning in, and we'll do a part 2 for sure on this topic. And we look forward to any of your comments and feedback and questions about the podcast and the episode. Until next time, thank you for joining us. And KL, thank you for sharing your story. It is so needed and so powerful. And there are people who need to hear this story.
And thank you, Steve. You've walked this path with me for years now, and you're a gem and a joy. And I'm so, so grateful for you. So thanks for stepping in here and hosting.
You are welcome. My
Okay.
pleasure.
All right. Take care, everybody.